stop my video as well now so people can concentrate on the slides, and then I'll put the video back on again at the end. Right, so the reason for choosing 2 designs, normally it's just 1 design from the collection per month, but the reason for picking 2 this month is because next week sees the birthdays of both William and May Morris just 1 day apart. William was born on the 24th of March, 1834, and May was born on the 25th of March, 1862. So it therefore seemed appropriate for this month's talk to focus on a design that unites father and daughter, as it has an identical name. So we're therefore highlighting 2 of the Society's objects featuring the beautiful honeysuckle pattern. And it's also a rare occasion when 2 designers for Morrison Company created a pattern with the same title. So I'm just going to move on to our first slide. There's always seems to be a slight delay moving on. So hopefully in a moment you'll see our honeysuckle pattern. Sorry, if you just bear with me. It worked in the run through and now we seem to have a screen stuck. Let's hope in a moment it's going to move. Oh, here we go. So William Morris designed his honeysuckle as a printed cotton, and May created hers for wallpaper. Both cottons and wallpapers were hand block printed, and we'll look at the traditional techniques involved at creating these 2 stunning designs, as well as exploring honeysuckle in a wider context by looking at other Morrison Company products featuring the pattern. So we'll start with May's honeysuckle, which she designed for wallpaper in 1883. The Society is extremely fortunate to have this beautiful original watercolour design, and it's the only design for wallpaper by May Morris in the Society's collection. Wallpapers were one of the first products offered by Morrison Company, although Morris's attempts to print his first 3 repeating patterns, Daisy, Trellis and Fruit, using oil-based inks on etched zinc plates were not really a success because the results were inconsistent. So Morris then had conventional wood blocks hand cut by Barrett, and in 1864 Morris approached the established wallpaper manufacturer of Jeffrey and Company of Islington to hand print his papers. The successful relationship between the 2 companies owed much to Metford Warner, the director, and under his lead, Jeffrey and Company employed some of the finest designers of the time: William Burgess, Walter Crane, CFA Voisey and A.H. McMurdo amongst them. And also Warner was completely sympathetic to Morris's ideals. He's quoted as saying that Morris allowed nothing to pass until he was quite satisfied it was right in both colour and design. The Metford Warner set up a special department at Jeffreys to handle Morris and Company wallpaper printing, and Morris himself was closely involved in production, choosing the colours and overseeing the printing. Warner recalled Morris with his hands blue from the dye vat, ordering his workforce not to improve my colourings. And always a perfectionist, if they were not precisely to his requirements, Morris would discard a complete set of printing blocks. So the process of block printing started with a design meticulously engraved onto the surface of a rectangular deal block, on which was mounted a layer of fine-grained wood. Fruit trees such as cherry and pear offered the right balance between durability and relative ease of carving the design. And those areas not required to print were then cut away. Multicoloured patterns required a separately carved block for every pigment in the finished design. And the carved surface was then inked with paint in a blanket-lined tray and then lowered face down onto the paper for printing. Pins on the corners of the blocks helped the printer to line up the design precisely. Each colour was printed separately along the whole length of the roll of paper, which was then hung up to dry before the next block of a different colour could be applied. The process was laborious, but required great skill and precision. A single block roll of paper could take up to 4 weeks to complete. So the Morrison Company wallpaper book we have in our collection promoted the qualities of hand printing papers over machine printed papers. It said, hand printed papers are produced very slowly, each block used being dipped into pigment and then firmly pressed onto the paper, giving a great body of colour. This process takes place with each separate colour, which is slow dried before another is applied. The consequence is that in the finished paper, there is a considerable mass of solid colour. Whereas machine printed papers are produced at great speed, all the colours being printed at one time and rapidly dried in a heated gallery. The consequence of the speed at which they are printed, there is merely a film of colour deposited on the surface of the paper. So for permanent use, we strongly recommend hand printed papers, which is what we have here with May's design. So Honeysuckle required 8 blocks to print, and it's inscribed on the front of our original design in pencil, notes on the printing blocks. And on the reverse of our design, it's inscribed Mr. Morris, Esquire, which has added uncertainty to whether May or William Morris designed Honeysuckle. And it also differs to May's other 2 designs for wallpapers, which were Horn Poppy and Arcadia. However, the heavily worked pencil outlines of Honeysuckle is characteristic of her designs and the technique as well. So it was attributed to May Morris for the first time in 1910, although the colourings in the centre are not quite like the designs we have in our collection by her for embroideries and other designs. So it's possible that it was perhaps a collaboration between father and daughter. And also it was common practice for designs to come under the Morris name to ensure their profitability. It's also stylistically very different to Morris's version of Honeysuckle, which we'll come to shortly. Nevertheless, confusion over the attribution of this wallpaper design still occurs today. So Honeysuckle was available in 4 colorways for wallpaper, and the Society is fortunate to have all of these examples in its collection, which we'll look at now. So the first 2 are almost identical in colouring to our original design. This one and this one is a little bit slightly darker. And then the other 2 that we have different coloured backgrounds. We have the green ground and the one with this beautiful blue background. And the Society also has a more modern reprint, this Sanderson reprint from the 1970s, which quite nicely illustrates the brighter colouring of that era, which responded to the fashion of the time. Morrison Company's wallpapers raised the status of English wallpapers to the highest standards, becoming internationally respected, and May's delightful pattern continues to be enduringly popular to this day. The other honeysuckle of our talk was created by William Morris in 1876 for printed cotton, and this is also in the Society's collection. So having had success with his first wallpaper designs and keen to re-establish the use of natural dyes in textile production, Morris began working with Thomas Wardle, the owner of a dyeing works in Leek in Staffordshire. Wardle produced Morris and Company textiles throughout the 1870s until Morris took the block printing in-house. His search for a site on which to consolidate all his production workshops ended in 1881 when he found Merton Abbey, an early 18th century calico printing works. The soft water of the River Wandle was ideal for the natural vegetable dyes which Morris used, preferring these over the harsher, synthetic, aniline dyes that were in common usage then. The 7-acre site at Merton Abbey already had a dye works and a bleaching field with an area large enough to allow for the necessary washing and drying of lengths of cotton. Block printing of fabrics was undertaken on long padded tables running the length of the workshop. The designs were carved onto a series of fruitwood blocks, as we've heard, similar to wallpaper printing, and one for each colour, and the process was similar. The die pads were mounted on trolleys, which could be pulled along the length of the table, and the ink block pressed down onto the cloth using a lead-weighted mallet. Later, the wooden blocks were modified with metal inserts padded with felt to hold the die. The die books demonstrate the complexities of printing and demonstrate Morris's extraordinary knowledge of the technology and chemical elements of the craft. Morris made comprehensive notes on the dyeing process, including how to maintain the correct atmosphere in the printing sheds, writing early on, "Some people boil a kettle in the shop to keep the air moist. Some hang up damp clothes. This last is best." And like May's wallpaper, the honeysuckle fabric also required 8 blocks and is a large-scale turnover pattern with heat. In a lecture on textiles, Morris said, "Do not be afraid of large patterns. If properly designed, they are more restful to the eye than small ones. Very small rooms, as well as very large ones, look better ornamented with large patterns." The original design for honeysuckle is in the collection of Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, and the Society also has the fabric in different colourways, such as this beautiful colourway here. William Morris said of his honeysuckle, "It is the most important we have or are likely to have." And May agreed, describing it as the most truly Morrisian in character of all his pattern making, the most mysterious and poetic, the very symbol of a garden tangle. Honeysuckle was one of Morris's most complex and successful patterns. Trial printing started in June of 1876 and took several months to perfect. The Morris and Company registration mark is clear on this example we have here on the Society's large, and this really large sample beautifully illustrates the block printing process, because you can just see the edge of the printing where the edge of the block ends. So I thought it'd be interesting to take a brief look at the way Morris used the honeysuckle flower in a variety of other products, from book covers and embroidery to tapestry and woven wools, demonstrating its popularity in Morris and Company items and showing how important it was to Morris. So we'll start by looking at another item in the Society's collection. The Roots of the Mountains, published by Reeves and Turner, was printed before Morris's groundbreaking last venture, the Kelmscott Press. This fantasy romance was said to have inspired Tolkien, and the book itself was considered by Morris to be the best-looking book issued since the 17th century. And this is one of the 250 luxury editions covered in the honeysuckle block-printed linen. So moving on to other Morris and Company products featuring the flower, here is the woodpecker tapestry, bordered with trailing honeysuckle all around. It depicts the story from the Roman poet Ovid, where a king is turned into a woodpecker by a sorceress. Morris's poem on the tale is contained within the upper and lower borders and reads, "I once the king and chief, now am the tree bark's thief, ever twixt trunk and leaf, chasing the prey." Morris loved tapestries, reminding him of medieval wall hangings, and he started to wish to revive what he called the noblest of the weaving arts. His first tapestry, a canthus and vine, was actually woven at Kelmscott House in his bedroom. The honeysuckle embroidery was designed by William Morris and worked by Jane, his wife, and Jenny, his daughter. Jenny was May's elder sister, and this is one of the few existing embroideries known to have been stitched by her and her mother. Its rich effect is due to the silk embroidery being stitched onto a block printed linen of the honeysuckle design. Both Jane and Jenny were skilled and experienced embroiderers. and May Morris described this as one of the finest of all Morris embroidery. The owl wall hanging was designed by John Henry Durrell and has scattered honeysuckle flowers throughout. Bought as a kit, this is an outstanding piece of embroidery for an amateur. It was worked by Mrs. Batty, who embroidered other Morris pieces, and this was a very ambitious design stitched onto a Morris & Company oak silk damask. Those of you who are familiar with the Society's headquarters at Kelmscott House may recall a similarly spectacular embroidery, also designed by Durrell, stitched onto the same green oak silk damask, the vine embroidery, which was meant to be part of a three-part screen, and it's on display in the Society's lower floors. And moving on to Tulip and Net, this is another design by Durrell, and although stylized, it looks like there are honeysuckle blooms in bunches of threes. Durrell began working for Morris & Company as an apprentice when he was a young boy in 1878. Showing signs of great potential, he began creating many designs across various media, including stained glass, tapestries, wallpaper, embroideries, and printed cottons, and eventually became artistic director of the company after Morris's death in 1896. And our last object featuring honeysuckle is often considered a quintessential Morris pattern, Compton, but it's now believed it was actually created by Durrell in the year of Morris's death. Here, the honeysuckles are clear and a prominent part of the design. May Morris said that Compton was the last wallpaper designed by her father. And so, just like honeysuckle wallpaper, there has been confusion over the attribution. And perhaps it could be a collaboration between Morris and Durrell, as I mentioned. It was difficult because they all went under the company style. It was designed especially for Compton Hall, near Wolverhampton, the home of Lawrence Hodgson, and it was executed both as a wallpaper and as a printed textile. The working drawing and blocks at the William Morris Gallery. Continuing the connection with Compton Hall, the nearby National Trust property, Whittick Manor, which some of you may be familiar with, appropriately also has a honeysuckle room in it, the walls of which are covered in the honeysuckle printed cotton in 1893. So I'd like to just mention about this continuing popularity of these two designs. Both honeysuckles from our collection have been widely exhibited in recent years. William's design for printed cotton formed part of the touring exhibition on Morris & Company that toured Scandinavia and ended in Iceland about 3 years ago. And May Morris's design was one of 3 of the Society's original wallpaper designs chosen by Yinka Shonibare 2 years ago in his touring exhibition on patterns called Criminal Ornamentation, which toured throughout the UK, demonstrating their contemporary relevance and enduring popularity. And I'd just like to end with a note on the study of flowers and their meanings, which was popular in Victorian times. Honeysuckle is said to symbolise happiness, which I think is an appropriate for these two designs, considering the pleasure that these two designs continue to bring over 140 years after they were first designed. And lastly, I'd like to wish a very happy birthday next Wednesday to William and next Thursday to May Morris. Right, so thank you very much for listening to that very brief run through of our 2 honeysuckle designs and looking at them in a wider context. And I'd be very happy to try and answer questions if anybody has any about our designs in the collection.
Thank you, Helen. Just to note, we've had no questions so far, but some people have been commenting on, I think it's your first picture, that said this wallpaper is free from arsenic. I wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
Yes, there has been, over the years, there's been quite a little bit of controversy sometimes about arsenic in products, and As you may know, arsenic was widely available in Victorian times, used in so many products, from like face powder to all sorts of everyday uses that people ingested, put on themselves, used in their homes, until the sort of the detriment to health became known. And so very early on, when Jeffrey and Company were printing Morris wallpapers, to get the green pigment, arsenic was used early on. But the designs in our collection, the wallpapers, are from a later period. So, and also because Morris and Company wanted to make everybody aware that there was no danger to health at all. So what happened was, when the wallpapers were in a damp environment, a gas could sometimes be emitted from the pigment, but it had to be quite a damp situation. So when you saw our wallpaper stand block, there, the front cover, it said "free from arsenic" in quite large letters, so people were aware that there was nothing dangerous included in the pigments made in the wallpaper. But every so often this controversy does come back, and people mention Morris's interest in Devon Great Consols, when there were the copper mines there, and one of the byproducts was arsenic. And people do mention this and various connections with arsenic, but we're definitely safe with ours. So if people want to look at our collection, there's no danger at all to health.
It's so interesting. Jane is just wondering if you could say again what honeysuckle symbolises. It seems that her sound just cut out at that point.
Yes, yeah, it symbolises happiness, which I think is a really nice way to end, because I think these bring a lot of happiness to people. So you can read a bit more into the symbolism of flowers. I think because the honeysuckle clings as well, as it's like a climbing plant. I think also the clinging nature of it, I also read, meant sort of faithfulness, sort of long-term commitment, and it's sort of enduring love. So all this sort of love and happiness sort of connotations there, which I think is a really nice thing to read into this as well.
Absolutely, it's lovely. Diane wants to know, what other keynote flowers did he base his designs on?
Oh, there are a lot to go through. I mean, acanthus is one of the more obvious ones. I mean, he actually designed a wallpaper called Acanthus with great big swirling acanthus leaves in it, and that's the most prominent plant in that design. But I mean, there's jasmine, tulips, roses, hawthorn, blackthorn. I mean, there's so many there. There's actually, you can buy, there are books. There's a book that came out by Rowan Bain on Morris's flowers, which is quite interesting, that goes into some of those. He tended to, May Morris particularly, she quite liked to look at more sort of hedgerow, field, meadow flowers. But Morris sometimes brought in a slightly more, mostly English flowers, but sometimes a little bit more exotic. So you see sunflowers coming into his as well, and other plants. But they tend to use sort of native plants and flowers. There's so much going on in them. You can see several different plants and flowers, mostly in each design. But yeah, there's a lot out there. I did some research into some of the main flowers that feature in his designs, which I could share with people if you'd like to, and also the plants and flowers that he had in the garden at Camscott House. I listed all the ones that he mentioned in his collected letters. So if people are interested in what he actually planted himself, I could also share that too.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Helen. Carolyn wants to know if you mentioned that there was a book popular in the Victorian era about flower symbolism.
Actually, I think there must have been. There's a lot now you can buy on floral symbolism. One of them is Floral Symbolica by Deborah Mankoff, who particularly looked at Pre-Raphaelite paintings and the symbolism in them. Like a lot of Rossetti's pictures have some have honeysuckles and other in them with the main female protagonist. Actually, in Victorian times, I imagine they possibly might have had books printed about symbolism then, but I think it's more likely to be more recent times, because in Victorian times it was quite common practice to actually know what flowers symbolized already. I think it was just in the sort of general domain, people just knew if they were getting whether they get a bunch of pink roses, what that meant, because the colors actually meant different things as well. And some flowers were unlucky, said to be unlucky, and I think it was just sort of common knowledge in those days as well. It was all in everyday language what flowers meant, and now we don't tend to know that so much. So there are definitely books available now on symbolism of flowers.
Yeah, that's so interesting. James actually asked, does it mention anywhere why both May and William were so fascinated by honeysuckle, or was it just a coincidence that they both, were fascinated by it?
No, I haven't found anything particularly on why they chose honeysuckle for the design. And as I've mentioned, it's a rare occasion when you've got two Morrison Company products, different designs with exactly the same name. And so no, I don't know exactly the reason why they chose this one. I think obviously it's just and because it was used in so many products, obviously Morris particularly found it a beautiful flower to look at, to actually use in the products. And I think it just perfectly sort of demonstrates the talent of both May and William, and they're very different. I think stylistically they're very different. So perhaps when May started doing her designing the 1880s of wallpapers, 3 wallpapers she designed in the 80s for Morrison Company, perhaps because it's so different, I think it's nice the way they could come up with a wallpaper as well as a fabric with the same design, looking just so remarkably different in character.
Definitely, thank you, Helen. And we've got a really interesting question. I'm not sure if you'll know the answer to, but was the colour mauve invented in Morris's lifetime? And did he start using it soon after it was invented? I'm not sure if you'll know the answer to that one.
No, I'm not sure about particular colours. I mean, there was quite a variety of different colours available. Obviously, before Morris started, bringing back the techniques of the natural vegetable plant dyes, other than Morrison Company, other producers were using chemical dyes, and obviously you could get almost any colour in the chemical aniline dyes. With Morrison Company's natural plant dyes, you do get sort of the pinks and purple type ones, but the actual particular mauve, I don't want to sort of guess about the different ones, but there's quite a variety of the natural dyes available.
Brilliant, thank you. Liz is wondering how many different colorways were produced of William's design?
You could get every design he created in several different colorways. In the Society's collection for the printed cottons, we don't have every colorway available of every cotton, but our wallpaper collection, I'd say, is more or less a comprehensive collection. So we have 2 wallpaper books, and you saw the front cover of one of them, the Free from Arsenic on there, and with them both combined, I'd say we're getting on for over 90%, I'd say, of all wallpapers produced at that time by Morrison Company, and they vary. I mean, for Honeysuckle by May Morris was in 4 colorways, but Horn Poppy, I think that's more 8 or 9, maybe even 10 different colorways of that. So there's quite a variety, and we've got Grafton only in 2 colorways, but Jasmine's in about 3 or 4, so they do vary. I think it maybe depends on the perhaps popularity of the design, how many different colorways were brought out. And some of the patterns you might have seen from one of May's designs, some of them have a printed, a dotted background as well, where they hammered pins into the surface of the woodblock, and that sort of changes the look of them as well, and the sort of shade of colouring.
Absolutely, it's so interesting how different they can look in different colorways. We have just one last question, and that is, how and when did you discover May's drawing? And I'm assuming, yeah, they're referring to the piece in our collection.
Well, the collection itself, we've actually had the majority of our collection was given to the Society in 1972 when Mrs. Helen Stevenson gave Kelmscott House, the building, to the society, and her collection that she'd acquired from Morrison, we think mostly directly from Morrison Company. So Honeysuckle was one of those designs that came with this like almost ready-made museum. So since the society was formed, we've known about honeysuckle, but I think in more recent years, it's become more popular, and awareness of having this design has definitely increased, which is really lovely. I think firstly, there's been those touring exhibitions, as I mentioned, around several countries, including Scandinavia and Iceland, that's had Morris's honeysuckle. And then the design by May Morris has featured not only in that Yinka Arts Council exhibition that toured around the UK, but it also featured prominently in a May Morris exhibition, firstly that was at the William Morris Gallery in Walthamstow, and then it toured to the Dovecot studio in Edinburgh. And I think because it's the only original design by May for wallpaper, we've got lots of embroidery designs by her, and jewellery out there, and obviously all of the writings that she did. But this is quite unusual to have this beautiful design for wallpaper. And so because May Morris has become better known, and I think more appreciated as a very talented designer in her own right, so Honeysuckle's been featuring prominently in these these exhibitions and books and catalogues that have been appearing in the last 2 or 3 years, which is really exciting to see May becoming better known, sort of stepping out the shadows of her father.
Brilliant, thank you, Helen. Just as I said, last question, we've just had 2 more questions pop up. Is that okay if we just answer those 2 last questions? This one is, when did natural dyes go out of popular use prior to Morris bringing them back, if you know the answer to that?
God, I don't know if I can answer that particularly. I know that the chemical dyes were very prevalent in Victorian times, so I imagine it was quite some time they'd been out of use, well before sort of Morris came to look at the dyeing when he went to Thomas Wardle's in Leek. So unfortunately, I can't give you an actual date in there, but it's a really good question. So I look that up and see to try and find the answer for that. But I imagine it must be quite some time that when the Victorians brought in the chemical dyes, as they were bringing all the mass production that was coming in, things were easier, cheaper, quicker to produce, and the chemical dyes offered a much quicker method than a natural dye. So I imagine we're going quite some time. And I think also because Morris found it very difficult to find somebody that still had that knowledge, until he found Thomas Wardle. So again, it makes me think that it must be quite a substantial number of years the natural dyes have been out of common use, because he found it so difficult to find anybody to help him bring them back.
Brilliant, thank you. So the last comment, and this really is the last comment now, is does William or May ever comment on each other's designs? I think that's a really interesting question. I'd love to know what each of them thought about the other's design.
We have comments on May Morris describing William Morris's patterns. It's more difficult to find comments on William commenting on May. She said I did actually write down what she said about Morris's honeysuckle. If I can just try and find my notes on it. Sorry, I don't want to keep you waiting. I can't find it quickly. I won't keep you waiting. But I think she said it was one of Morris's best patterns. Oh, here we go. He commented on his design, saying how important it was. And yeah, May Morris said it's of Morris's honeysuckle. She said it's the most truly Morrisian in character of all his pattern making, the most mysterious and poetic, the very symbol of a garden tangle, which I think is really nice. And she also said about his patterns in general, he had a heaven-sent gift and just naturally talented at pattern design.
That's really lovely, thank you, and also an excellent place, I think, to end the talk there. I've had a few questions saying, is this going to be available at a later date? And yes, we will be uploading this talk onto YouTube. And also there's been some interest in that research you mentioned about flowers at Kelmscott House, Helen, so we'll have to make that available as well.
Great,
and
yeah.
if we have any details on the next talk, and I believe you do, Helen?
Oh yes, we do. So firstly, the William Morris Society's got a very exciting programme currently starting this Saturday, actually, on the Kelmscott Press. It's the anniversary this year. And if you look on our website, you'll see that this Saturday, William Peterson is giving a talk on the Kelmscott Press, which is going to be absolutely wonderful. He's a world-renowned expert on the Kelmscott Press. So that's a brilliant start to the season, the whole year of celebrating the press. And then our next short curators talk is on the 20th of April. So it's the third Tuesday at 11 o'clock. So you're having your morning 11s. And next month's talk is actually another of my very favourite designs, but not very well known. It's the reason I've picked lamb and flag is because we've got Easter next month, and so this is celebrating one of our ecclesiastical designs. Lamb and flag was designed by Philip Webb, so I thought it'd be interesting to look at a different designer, and it's quite appropriate for a church setting. So we have 3 original designs by Webb in our collection, including the actual pounced designs for actually producing this, and it was actually meant for an altar frontal at Llandaff Cathedral. I was fortunate enough to visit Llandaff a couple of years ago, and so we're going to be looking at his design and then looking at Bessie Burden, who was Jane Morris's sister, the finished embroidery for the altar frontal based on our design that she stitched for Llandaff, and we'll be looking at that in the wider context of the other items at Llandaff Cathedral in Wales, because it's an absolute treasure trove of pre-Raphaelite and arts and crafts items with Rossetti, Burne-Jones, as well as Morris being featured in there. So that's next month's talk on the 20th of April. So I very much hope people can join us for that as well.